It's Wulf, and it's time to talk about Cyberpunk 2077. Now, normally I don't do like full game reviews. You guys, if you've watched the channel, you've probably noticed this. Whenever I do reviews, I tend to stick to more physical products, I guess. I reviewed that racing wheel, I reviewed that computer a while ago, and I review albums and stuff, but when I do that, I usually focus more on like the artwork of them rather than the actual, well, I mean, I do talk about the actual music, but a lot of my reviews for that stuff is like the packaging and the artwork and stuff like that. But I got Cyberpunk 2077 about a week ago, and I've been playing it. It is pretty much the only game that I've played for like a week straight, and so I haven't really, like, I've gotten other stuff done, but I have spent a lot of time playing it, so I feel like I really need to do something with it to be productive. And also, since I've spent so much time playing it, I think that also kind of makes it warrant a little bit of attention on my channel. Just a heads up, I didn't record any gameplay of the story or anything before I'm recording this audio, so I don't know if there'll even be any gameplay in this video. It might just be like a picture of like the Cyberpunk logo and then my words. If there is gameplay, it'll probably just be like really generic sort of like side activity gameplay. I will note though that this review is going to have a lot of spoilers in it. So if you haven't played the game yet, I'm just going to tell you right now, it's definitely worth playing, and I would suggest to look at as little media about it as possible, so that way like any surprises or whatever in the game will actually like be kind of hard hitting, which is another thing I want to mention is like later on in the review is the advertising in this game, because I think that kind of actually screwed up some of the story points a little bit. So overall though, just kind of to get to the point for anybody who hasn't played it yet but still kind of wants my opinion on it without listening to the spoilers later on in the video, I also don't usually tend to give like number ratings for games, but I feel like this one in my brain right now is like an 8 out of 10. And I just want to note, I played this on a base like launch year model PS4 on update 1.06, I believe, which is the current one at the time of recording this audio. So yeah, that's just something to note. So my opinions and stuff aren't based off of like the launch edition of the game, but they're also not based on like playing it on a PS5 or a PS4 Pro or anything, because can't even find a PS5 anywhere anyway. Yeah, just felt like that was an important thing to note. So as for the actual review, let's talk about performance first, because that's kind of not really a spoilery thing and also is something that people have been talking about an insane amount with Cyberpunk. So as I noted, I am playing this on pretty much what all of the like review outlets have said is the worst possible combination of things how to play this game. So I played it on a base PS4, not a PS4 Pro, not a PS4 Slim or anything. I own just a normal PS4, like I said, from launch year and everything, and that's what I played it on. And I just want to say right off the bat that despite all the negative performance flack that the game has been getting, it is perfectly playable as of update 1.06. The entire game, the whole way through, I did not encounter any game-breaking bugs. I encountered a bug in one side mission that like prevented me from completing the mission, but the mission was still actually completable, but just not in one way, like the way I was trying to do it. It wasn't completable, but I probably will mention that later on. So overall, the performance and like graphics of this game, the thing that keeps coming to mind for me, like graphics wise, is Fallout 4 and Fallout 76. I think that the graphics on Cyberpunk 2077 are kind of similar to the graphic quality of Fallout 4 and Fallout 76. It's not exactly the same, but that's really like the first thing that popped into my mind with this game, was that it looks kind of like those. I don't know if everybody else will agree with me on that. And also that's something to note is that the graphics quality changes depending on how much like is loading into the game at once, because if you're kind of like driving really fast and a bunch of stuff is loading in at one time, it won't look that great. So as for other areas of like performance and quality though, yes, the game lags. It lags a lot when you're moving around in heavily populated areas or your character is driving. The thing that I compared it to, I think on Twitter, was Deadly Premonition, and that might sound like a weird comparison, but I think it's a valid comparison, because Deadly Premonition also had very, very laggy just like gameplay, especially in the open world areas, but it was still fully playable. It was just slow, and I think that's kind of exactly where Cyberpunk also lies, at least currently. It runs slow, but it's still perfectly playable. And the other thing to note is that the slowdown in like the low FPS tends to pretty much only be in very populated areas or outside. When you're in a lot of missions, which a bunch of missions games take place indoors, when your character's in areas that are like loaded in and there's not like an insane amount of action going on, the game ran at like at least 30 FPS, which for a console port of a game is perfectly playable if you're used to other console games. And so there's a lot of scenarios where like all the stuff that I've seen about how awful the game runs, like yeah, it's true, but there's also a lot of areas in the game where that's not really true and where the game runs as fine as any other PS4 game. And then as for crashes, I know a lot of people talked about crashes. The game crashed for me like 4 times the entire time I was playing it, and I saw some people online saying that it was crashing for them every like half hour or hour. And my question is just like, what were they doing? Because the game crashed for me. I think 3 times it had an actual crash where it like I needed to go like the game like exited out and crashed and everything. And then 1 time where it just froze and I just kind of went back to the PlayStation menu and closed application and reopened it. So like, I mean, for a game that I spent a week straight playing, 4 crashes, I mean, you aim for no crashes, but it's another thing where it's not as bad as some of the other reports that I've been seeing, so long as you're not like, I guess, blowing up everything in your path, because that's not how I played it. So overall performance, yeah, it's not great, but I mean, it's definitely playable. So all the things about like how laggy it is and everything, if you really want to play the game, don't let that deter you from trying to play the game, because it's still playable and it's still enjoyable in its current state, and it'll probably only get better as they continue to update it. I think another thing I want to discuss a little bit also before I get into like story stuff is the game's packaging. This game comes with so much stuff. For the base edition of the game, I got just the normal version of Cyberpunk 2077, which comes with a sleeve, like a cardboard sleeve, the game, postcards, a little like compendium thing, which I would heavily recommend reading, because then it kind of explains the game, which I'll come back to that in a second here about like the kind of surrounding world of Cyberpunk that this game takes place in. So the packaging itself, like the game just came with like a lot of extra stuff for a game that has already gone down to just $50 in a lot of places. I mean, most games don't even come with an instruction manual. I mean, this didn't really come with an instruction manual, but it kind of came with, I guess, something kind of like an instruction manual. So it's, you know, it just came with a lot of stuff, which is a nice touch. But as I was mentioning, there's like the World Compendium thing that I said you should really read, which is something to do while the game is installing. That's when I read it. I guess this is kind of where to jump into talking about like the story. So Cyberpunk 2077, I didn't look at a lot of advertising for it because at first I wasn't that interested in it, and then once I got interested in it, I didn't want to like spoil anything for myself. But I think some people may not be aware, there's actually at least 2 other games in the Cyberpunk series. Well, there's more than 2, but there's like 2 mainline ones. The thing is, they're not video games though. They're actually pen and paper RPGs. Cyberpunk 2013 and Cyberpunk 2020. Both of those years come into play in the story. Now, this is interesting because it adds a lot to the story, because it kind of explains a lot of things, but also if you're just playing the game, there's times where you're kind of wondering why things are happening or what certain events are and stuff. And if you haven't like looked into any of the other surrounding stuff, there's times where stuff won't necessarily make a lot of sense. Like one of the things that I didn't really get throughout the game, at least for a good portion of it, was what exactly Johnny Silverhand's issue with Arasaka was. And it's mentioned at one point that he was like a soldier and didn't like it or whatever, but it's not really explored beyond that, and I think it is in like the pen and paper RPGs. But yeah, so that's one thing to consider, is that I don't know, I feel like they almost should have like recapped what happened maybe a little bit more clearly in the beginning of the game or something, because even without knowing anything else about the Cyberpunk universe, you still understand most of the game, but there's definitely areas that could have used clarification that I think could have been helped either through maybe like a more in-depth compendium or just a short little introduction video about like the universe you're about to step into, especially because also Cyberpunk 2077 takes place quite a long time after the rest of the Cyberpunk stuff. Like I said, I think the most like recent Cyberpunk thing outside of this game was Cyberpunk 2020, which takes place in 2020, so that's 57 years before Cyberpunk 2077. 50 years is a long time. As for the actual story, man, I don't even know where to start talking about it, because there's a lot of negatives and positives about the story. I think something to go back to is I was confused about Johnny Silverhand's motivations. So Johnny Silverhand as a character in this game is interesting, and I think that the use of Keanu Reeves was really smart, but also the way that they decided to advertise the game using Keanu Reeves, I think, was stupid. So I don't have time to in capacity in my brain to talk about the whole story. So I'm going to talk about like specific points I think that I thought could use some work. But the introduction of Johnny Silverhand was not nearly as effective as it would have been had CD Projekt Red kept Keanu Reeves' role as like a hidden thing, like as a surprise for the game. Because, and like I said, major spoilers in this review, when you finish Act 1, V gets shot in the face and dies for a little while, and then it, pops up Cyberpunk logo and everything, and it's kind of like one of those things like, the game's not going to end after the first act, but you can kind of tell that like there's a major story shift going on. And so you start this mission, I think it's called Love Like Fire, and it's the first time you play as Johnny and where you get introduced to him, and you see yourself in a mirror in that mission, and you see like, holy crap, it's Keanu Reeves. And I think that would have been so much more effective if everybody didn't already know that Johnny Silverhand was going to be Keanu Reeves. I think that would have made that twist way more effective, and might have even made people give better reviews to the game if they saw that without already knowing it was going to happen. And that was another thing too. I don't know if they advertised this anywhere, but the fact that Johnny Silverhand doesn't actually exist was something that I saw people talking about online, which is yet another kind of like weird thing for them to like let get out into the wild, because it's another twist. Like when I saw Johnny Silverhand like in Keanu Reeves was in the game, I assumed that he was like another character, and that's kind of how they presented it for a while. And then when I started seeing people say that he was like not real or whatever, it's like, well, that just kind of spoils it a little bit, that he ends up being kind of an imaginary friend style character throughout a big portion of the game. So also just Johnny Silverhand, for being such an important character, I don't think he's that well developed as a character. Like he's pretty much the secondary protagonist of the entire game in a lot of ways. I mean, he's in the body of the protagonist, yet you don't really learn much about him. He's like hardcore punk rocker turned like semi-terrorist, but you really don't learn a ton of his motivations until pretty late in the game, and even still, it's sort of unclear where exactly his hate for Arasaka comes from. Is it just that he was like really angry about being a soldier, or the alt thing? But the alt thing, in theory, would have maybe not made him as upset if he wasn't already angry at Arasaka, because he like sort of believes that Arasaka was after him and went after Alt instead. And in general, also, Alt isn't really introduced until like way late in the game for being such an important character, like literally the deciding factor in the ending of the game. There's also other characters that are sort of introduced in the Johnny Silverhand area and other areas of the game that really aren't explored. Like Thompson, the news reporter, is there, but he's in it for one mission, and then Johnny like punches him out, and then you never see him anywhere else in the game again. Santiago is introduced in the one Johnny Silverhand mission, and then also not really explained at all. And even Carrie, Johnny's bandmate, he's in the game, but it's totally possible to completely miss him, because in my playthrough I didn't run into Carrie at all except the Johnny missions. I only found out that he was there through like other stuff, like media things, articles and crap that I read about the game after finishing it. And that's another area also where the pre-existing Cyberpunk universe lore comes into play, because those characters, some of them are present in that lore, but not really it's explored a lot. And kind of the same thing with Adam Smasher. Even though he's an antagonist, he's not really explained a whole lot either, outside of just kind of being a general like bad guy. Like you see this character that's more Borg than Cyb, like he's a cyborg, but he's pretty much all robot, and you're kind of like, well, how did he get like that? And it's not really explained in the game. But if you look on the Cyberpunk wiki, you can read all about how that happened, because it was in the books. So just another area where I think that maybe a little bit more background included in the game for characters that are in the game would have been useful, especially also just because the Cyberpunk books came out like over 20 years ago. So it's not like one of those things where they're recent. Like they're not even easy to get your hands on, I don't believe, anymore. Like I looked on Amazon and you can get Cyberpunk 2020, but it's like $40. You can't even find Cyberpunk 2013 anywhere. And then another thing about the Johnny Silverhand missions, I don't know if there's others like that are inside missions, but there's only 2 in the entire game. So for a character who is so hyped up, and then that like people find out you get to play as, to only have him in 2 missions in the game is yet another weird decision. And then also I think this is a good area to kind of talk about another area of complaint that I had. So Act Act 1 feels disparate from the rest of the game, which I suppose makes sense because it's sort of a prelude, but they pull one of those things where like almost everybody you meet in Act 1 besides like 3 characters all end up dying pretty much immediately at the end of Act 1, or like one of them dies later on in like a side mission, but you don't even interact with that character again. Well, I don't even know why I'm saying it because I already warned spoiler. Evelyn gets injured at the end of Act 1, but you don't actually like interact with her again until she just straight up dies. So that's like, you meet all these characters. You meet Jackie, Evelyn, Dex, T-Bug. Am I missing anybody? I think that's about it for all the characters that are like important in the Act 1 and then kind of end up dying or disappearing. Act 1 feels like, I don't know, Act 1 just felt more significant than the other acts, which is weird because Act 2 is where the game starts to open up, which is another thing to get to in a minute because it throws so much at you. Act 1 feels like what the back of the box said, because the game kind of advertises itself like on the box literally as like you play as a mercenary trying to hunt down a chip, which by the way, just mark that off as another similarity between Fallout New Vegas and Cyberpunk 2077. Actually, let me just go off into a tangent here and explain those real quick. Cyberpunk 2077 and Fallout New Vegas, you're chasing a chip. Well, rather, Cyberpunk, you're trying to get a chip out of you later in the game. You get shot in the face and survive in both Cyberpunk 2077 and Fallout New Vegas. Desert City in California, kind of, because Las Vegas is in Nevada. So Desert City on the west coast of the US. Post-apocalyptic. Cyberpunk isn't necessarily post-apocalyptic, but it's just like far future, but it's kind of apocalyptic because there's been all the wars and stuff. So you can pretty much sum up Cyberpunk 2077 and Fallout New Vegas in like the same sentence, which is kind of interesting. But what I was saying, Act 1 just feels like a lot more important than the other acts because there's a lot more decisions to be made in Act 1 that actually have significance, it seems like. I mean, you've got to plan for this heist and then you finally do the heist and it's this big grand mission and everything and stuff goes wrong and you've got to escape and all that stuff. But I think the best example of kind of the choice being important is in the mission where you have to get, I can't remember the name of it, but that robot from the Maelstrom that Militech kind of like they stole from Militech or whatever, because there's 3 ways that mission can play out, but there's also like a lot involved in how that mission ends up playing out, whether you talk to Militech, whether you side with the lady there or the guy, whether you use Militech's money or not to buy the robot back, whether you check for the virus on the Militech chip, whether you pay with your own money for the robot, whether you just fight the Maelstrom for the robot. There's a lot that goes in that one mission, and it feels like future missions don't really have that level of depth. And then at the end of Act 1, everything just kind of, it almost gets too straightforward. Like in the beginning of Act 1, you're kind of left totally in the dust as to what exactly is going on, because you know you're about to steal this chip, but you don't know what's on it, you don't really know the characters you're working with, there's a lot of mystery and stuff. End of Act 1, when you finally get the chip shoved into your head and Johnny starts wreaking havoc, the main plot of the game becomes very straightforward. Get Johnny out of your head. And that's the whole rest of the game. And it's like, yeah, other stuff happens, but there's not really any big twists and turns beyond that, I'd say, like, because you know the end goal, really. Whereas in Act 1, you know that the goal is to steal something, but you don't know what's going to happen when you do. But the rest of the game, it's like the goal is to get the chip out of your head, so you kind of know that you'll either get the chip out of your head or die. Like there's only really 2 options for the rest of the game. Also, like I said a little bit ago, Act 2 again feels weird. Like the whole organization of the game feels strange because Act 3 is literally one mission. Act 1 is a prelude where you can't really do that much. Act 2 throws so much stuff at you. You finish Act 1 and you get let loose back into the world and you start getting all these texts from all these fixers and they're trying to sell you cars and stuff, and you get all these side missions and you got the main missions, and I swear I spent like 3 days just doing side missions. And the thing is, it's not like you can really hold off on doing those side missions because once you start the first main mission in Act 3, you have to go through the entirety of Act 3 before you can return and do any more side missions. So I think that, I don't know, I just kind of wish that they had organized that a little bit differently, because it's like there's so much all at once when you get to that point in the game. And similarly, it's not even just the side missions that there's so much going on all at once, but there's also the main missions in Act 2 follow like 3 separate strands, because you've got the stuff where you've got to go find Hellman, you've got to find Evelyn, and then Takamura also wants your help. So you've got 3 separate stories going on, and they're all kind of related, but they all involve pretty much different casts and stuff, and it can be kind of a lot to remember, because by the time you do 2 of them, you get to the 3rd one, you've kind of forgotten what exactly the goal in that strand is. And I think it would have made more sense if they organized those in a linear fashion, because they're so non-linear as it is that I don't think it would have like injured the story if they just came up with some sort of reason why those had to be done in a specific order. And then as for side missions, I want to say that this is definitely one of the areas where the game shines. And also, all the negative things that I'm talking about, I don't want it to sound like those take away from the positives of the game. My 8 out of 10 still stands. It's still a very, very good game. There's just a lot of things that as I was playing through, I was like, man, this could have been kind of done a little bit better. So side missions in the game, they're good, but also sometimes they can get you don't really understand the point of them. Like, the Beat on the Brat series of missions is kind of annoying because all of the enemies are really tough, yet it's one of the first side missions you get. So you end up kind of wondering, like, am I putting my skill points into the wrong area, or like what exactly am I doing? Speaking of that, I forgot to make this comparison earlier about gameplay. Gameplay wise, this game reminds me of a combination of Fallout, Watch Dogs, and Far Cry, but that's, anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. So these Beat on the Brat side missions, the first guy that you fight is actually 2 dudes, which isn't really like a great way to introduce you to that, but you can defeat those guys pretty easily, like early on, if you have the right, skill set or whatever, and points allocated to the right areas in the beginning of the game. But the other dudes that you fight, they're like really tough to fight. Like, they can down you in like 2 hits, which is annoying and frustrating, because even when I was near the end of the game, those fights were still hard, and even the last one I still couldn't beat, and that was pretty much the end of the game that I was at. So again, just that's kind of a weird thing. And then there's other side missions that are in the same vein of, you don't really understand what exactly the point is. Like, there's a side mission that wants you to pay Victor back for giving you some new implants for free, cyber implants. He like changes your eyes or whatever in the beginning of the game for the heist, and you owe him like 21,000 euro dollars, and you pay him back. You don't actually seem to get anything in return for that, except for maybe being able to shop at him as a Ripper Doc again, but even still, you don't really see a point. There's a similar thing with all the tarot cards around the city that you can collect all of them, and then you tell Misty that you collected all of them, but then you don't really get anything out of it except for maybe like enhanced versions of her tarot readings. But you kind of wonder, like, what did I spend the time on that for? And then similarly, there's the Cyber Psycho missions, which is another mission that is given you at the beginning of the game, and you're like, did they make this just to take up space in my journal? Because it's clearly a mission that's going to take forever to complete, because you have to take down like 18 cyber psychos without like killing them. So you've got to, either use a melee weapon, or I don't even think you can sneak up on them. And then you also constantly get gigs, which are pretty much just for cash. Like, they don't actually add anything to the story. Which is another area to mention, is that the side missions, there's so many of them, but they're really important to do because they directly affect the ending of the game. If you don't do any of them, you only have like one option for the end of the game. Which I just want to add also, I think it's weird that the ending that a couple of media outlets have said is like arguably the best ending, and it's also the one that I got, the one where you pretty much run away with the Nomads and Pan Am after invading Arasaka with them. In order to get that ending, you have to pretty much follow the romance Pan Am path, which I think is strange to tie a romance option to an ending of the game, especially because the other romanceable characters, I don't think have that. And I think you can do that ending even without having to romance Pan Am, but it focuses so much on one character, whereas similar characters don't really get that attention. It's just strange because Judy, who's the other guy, there's a police officer guy you meet in a side mission. They're both important characters as well, and they're also like romance options for your character depending on what gender and voice type your character has or whatever. But they don't affect the ending as much as Pan Am, which I just think is kind of strange, especially because Judy also plays roles in multiple main story missions as Pan Am does. So I think that's weird to allot that behind that, especially also because Pan Am's romance option is, at least so far as I've read, locked behind having a male character. So that's just kind of another oddity of the game. Speaking of the endings, I also read online that most of them kind of end up doing the same thing. Like, I think with all of the endings, you get the option of whether to keep your body or to kind of let Johnny take over your body. And so that's like 3 endings regardless of path that end up being the same thing if you you choose to let Johnny take over your body and you go off into cyberspace. But I think even in some of the other endings, the ending is the same pretty much, except for with like a slight variation. I believe that Pan Am's ending or the secret ending, maybe, are the only ones that are really different, which again is kind of weird. And all the endings of the game are super gray, which I don't know. It's one of these games where like you spend so much time in it that you're kind of like, couldn't you give a little something extra, like some slight indication of happiness at the end of the game? Because in pretty much all the endings, you either have the choice to become an AI or V lives maybe 6 more months or whatever. Like, you don't get that much hope in the end of the game, which is annoying because you spend so long playing the game. It's like, oh, well, that was pretty much useless. If I just didn't play the game, V wouldn't have even ended up in this situation. Okay, so probably a little bit of an awkward audio cut there. I originally had ended the video already earlier on, and then I went to bed and woke up the next day and had even more stuff to say. So here we are next day, continuing on with my thoughts. So I know I've mentioned Johnny Silverhand a whole ton of times already in this rambling review thing, but I do want to just kind of quickly mention one positive. I know that a lot of this has been criticism, but one positive thing about Johnny Silverhand, I think it was really, really smart by CD Projekt Red to have Keanu Reeves play him, despite what I said earlier about the bad advertising stuff. I think it was actually really smart of them to have such a famous, well-known actor play Johnny Silverhand, because I think it sort of screws with your perception of Johnny Silverhand, because he's technically an antagonist, because he's, you know, like a brainworm. He's trying to take over your brain. And I think that even though it doesn't really end up having that much of an effect on the end of the game, like, I don't think that there's a point where Johnny will, like, really steal your body without you being able to do anything about it. I think it's interesting that so many people are going to play the game, see Keanu Reeves, and, like, want to be friends with the character that Keanu Reeves is playing, despite the fact that in reality you would want to do the opposite, because you don't want to become too friendly with the literal tapeworm in your brain. And also, speaking of Johnny Silverhand, again, I mentioned earlier that you don't really ever understand, I mean, you kind of do, but it's never like really deeply, fully explained Johnny Silverhand's hatred towards Arasaka. I think that also can kind of be said about Rogue and some of the other characters, and I know it's sort of said that Johnny paid Rogue and his little like gang there to invade Arasaka with him, but they seem to also have their own grudges against Arasaka that aren't really fully explained either. Rogue in particular, though, just because she pops up in both missions. I don't remember if Santiago does or not. I know Thompson doesn't, but Thompson's kind of there for his own reasons. But anyway, that's another area too where there could have been maybe some more explanation as to what these other characters' issues with Arasaka was, and if they even really had issues with Arasaka, or if they were doing it purely just for money. Also, kind of an unrelated thing, but sort of the last major thought that I had about this, I don't get why they decided to put V's full name in kind of a throwaway scenario. You know, you play the whole game, and by the way, I'm going to be using he/him pronouns for V because my V was a male in my playthrough, so that's just how I referred to him as I played the game. When V goes to Clouds to find Evelyn, that's the only time V's full name is uttered in the entire game, and it's by one of the dolls at Clouds. And I think it's the strangest thing that they decided to have that be the scenario where you learn V's full name, because it's like a complete throwaway of his name. You hear it from a character that occurs in the game one time, gives you a little bit of information, and then you never see again, which I just think is really strange for them to have such a sort of arguably major reveal when V is so secretive about his name in general, be just sort of like a random thing. And it kind of makes sense because the doll only knows about V from him jacking into their system, so like the doll probably knows everything about V, so of course first instinct would be to use his actual first name and not a nickname. But still, it just seems so strange that they did that, and then that they don't have V's full name pop up anywhere else in the game. And the main thing I'm thinking about in relation to that is the fact that none of the characters who V either becomes really close friends with or romances will ever say his full name either, despite the fact that they probably would, or at least should, know it. Like, Jackie never says V's full name, and V doesn't appear to ever tell Jackie his full name, which is sort of strange with how friendly they are to each other. Like I said earlier in my playthrough, it was the one where V runs away with the nomads at the end, so Pan Am ended up being V's romance in that playthrough. She never says his name, he never says his name to her, and I don't believe any of the other romance options say his name or learn his name or anything, and nobody really seems to. And the weird kind of comparison that I can think of is Delamain never uses V's full name either. And I suppose that V never ends up jacking into a Delamain. I like, he might, but he never like jacks into the Delamain system. But you would think that Delamain would have access to that information also, but Delamain never seems to appear to ever try to call V his full name ever, which is again kind of strange. So anyway, I think that's the actual end of my thoughts on Cyberpunk 2077. Just to kind of reiterate what I said at the beginning of the review, I do actually think this game is really, really good, but this review ended up being a lot of criticisms because there was just like, it was one of those things where just like a lot of small things kind of popped up as I played through the game that I was like, wait a minute about, and I kind of felt like, you know, to some extent, it's like you can sit there and praise something a lot, but it's also important to also talk about things that you dislike in something, so that way, in a video game sense, the developers can go and fix it in an update or know it for future games or DLCs or whatever. So that's kind of why I ended up focusing on a lot of my criticisms for the game, for this sort of review thing. Anyway, as I said pretty much like half an hour ago at this point in the video, I didn't really plan on doing a review of Cyberpunk, but I just sort of wanted to do something because I've spent so much time playing it that I felt like it kind of deserved to be talked about on the channel. So anyway, I don't really have any plans to make any other Cyberpunk videos because it is such a story-driven single-player game that there's not really a whole ton for me to discuss, except for maybe like exploring the comparisons between it and Fallout New Vegas some more, but I kind of already summarized that in this video. Maybe when like the multiplayer for it comes out, I can do something with that. Also, one last quick note that actually just popped into my mind. This is sort of almost a video made for CD Projekt Red to see, to you know, like hear criticisms of their game or whatever. If anybody from CD Projekt Red is watching this, heavy suggestion about the whole performance thing, please just like implement like a low resolution mode, at least as a temporary fix for PS4 and the original Xbox One, because like I think that would be a really, really good idea to at least as like a temporary thing for people to be able to play the game at a reasonable frame rate. I think it would be really, really good idea to just implement pretty much a switch to just make the game run at a really low resolution, not really, really low, but like 480p or something, if it's possible. Make the game run at like 480p or something with a focus on frame rate, because in most games I think that frame rate is pretty important as compared to resolution, at least for like gameplay terms. So that's just one more little suggestion. Also, actually, one more thing in relation to graphics and stuff. If you are playing on a PS4, on like a base PS4, I don't know if this actually helps or not, but I pretty quickly after starting the game, I went into the settings and turned off everything. I turned off motion blur, all the settings that I had options to change, I turned off, and that seemed to like slightly improve the performance on my normal base PS4. Not sure if it actually made a difference or not, but I would suggest trying it if the gameplay, if the frame rate and stuff is just like absolutely abysmal for you. So yeah, that's just one more suggestion. Anyhow though, I think that's pretty much the end of this video. If you watched the whole way through, listened the whole way through, thanks for listening / watching, and I will see you in future videos, and bye-bye.